What are some of the best D&D campaign ideas you've ever had? Part 1. Mr. Ripper here. So okay, this is a long one. It's only one entry by my good friend Mike Arnold. The next episode will be full of shorter single ideas. If you prefer me Mr. Ripper over Scott, hit the subscribe button so I can take my channel back. This was a campaign I'm still proud of, so feel free to lift part or all of it for your own group if you like it. This was a long story that took many sessions to play, so I'm compressing it to just the high points. The campaign started with a fairly simple quest. Several rural schools on the outskirts of a town had been having trouble with bandit raids. Some kid named Johnny had gone missing, the parents and kids were all scared, and a simple smash the clearly labeled bad guys mission sounded great to the party. They had no idea what they were getting themselves into. Upon getting involved they began asking questions as they laid in wait for the bandits, but the answers they were getting didn't make sense. The bandits weren't attacking in any coherent order, and while the schools had been hit recently the nearby businesses with money on site had not. Eventually the bandits showed, and then things started to get creepy. Some came in swinging at the kids and teachers, but some of them attacked the building, and some of them attacked the trees around the building. While none were particularly skilled or difficult to kill, they did real damage and killed several sympathetic NPCs before the group fended the worst of them off. That's when they noticed the magic attacks coming in. Attacks that didn't seem to be associated with anyone or anything present. Some were fire or acid balls, but quite a lot of the magic effects were just wrong. One of the bandits started to grow to a huge size, 16-foot tall giant, but only about 1/3 of him was affected, and the screaming as he died was horrific enough to unsettle even some of the veteran players. And even as the blood pouring from his splintered skull slowed to a trickle, none of the players had touched him. The rabid shrieks of grown men trying to kill trees and rocks joined the background chorus of crying children. The group did what they could, but about half of the bandits made it out before they could kill them. One of the last to die on sight was killed while trying to rape a tree stump. The players were finally shocked and startled enough to start thinking with their brains and not their swords. Suddenly the strongest character with the most min-maxing wasn't the hero anymore. They started asking questions. It turned out the attacks they had been called to deal with were not an isolated incident. This particular village just happened to have enough cash to get their attention. Out of perhaps half a dozen small villages around the central town, all had experienced similar attacks, and the frequency was increasing. This one attack the players had seen involved dozens of bandits, but the hints they were getting pointed to many multiples of that number at play here, far more than they could take on by themselves. Of course, they tried to take them on themselves without backup. Instead of winding up dead or cunningly killing their terrible enemy though, they ended up talking to some of the bandits as they tried to sneak in and find the bandit king. It turned out the bandits were scared. They had no idea what was happening either. From their perspective they would black out and wake up somewhere different covered in injuries or surrounded by bodies. They had no idea why, and more than a few suspects had been brutally beaten to death, only for things to get even worse. Many of them had run away from the area. Some had run off into the woods, only to wake up back at camp with no idea how they got there. For the first time one of the jocks in the player group had the good sense to observe that a group of outsiders being discovered in these circumstances wouldn't be likely to have a particularly good day. They got the hell out of Dodge. But now what? They had been called in to save the school kids, but things were only getting darker. Did they really intend to just abandon the children and run away? One of the true assholes of the party was pushing that option hard as this was apparently a situation he couldn't stab his way out of. He was the one that tripped over the body of little Johnny in the woods. The flesh had been shredded, but all the bite marks they could identify looked to have come from human-sized mouths. They made the arsehole carry the body back for burial in a canvas sack that served as a makeshift body bag. While camping in the woods that night, arsehole got first watch. It was a little after nightfall when the canvas sack sat up and began screaming. As they all scrambled for weapons the thing in the bag began to grow arms, legs, teeth, all while screaming for help, and when the noise finally ended what had been a child's body was now a misshapen lump of flesh and limbs the size of a horse twitching on the ground. The player group was finally beginning to get worried, and when they carried word of what they'd found back to the village council decided that enough was enough. and that with the first snows of winter already on the way it was time to leave and head to the central town for shelter. The group elected to escort the group to the main town, and by now some of the more savvy players had their detective hats on. There were no big bads or evil armies around to lay the blame on. There had been no other problems recently, and there wasn't anything of value to steal even in the large town. Unless of course you counted the library. The central town just happened to have the biggest library for thousands of miles, located in the main library complex at the apex of the hill that towered over the town spread out below. A foot of snow had fallen the previous night and the party trudged through the drifts to get into the outskirts of town where numerous chimneys smoked in the morning air. Curiously, only the houses on the outskirts of town even had chimneys. They met up with several printmakers over breakfast at the local inn who happily regaled them with their story. They hadn't heard about the bandits, but they'd been pretty busy lately. Apparently the town and the fortress on the hill that housed the library had been here for as long as anyone could remember. The huge walls atop the hill and the library's interior layout strongly suggested the building had once been a castle whose original purpose had long been forgotten, and the only piece of it that still functioned, the library, had grown over time until it had taken over the entire structure and many of the subterranean tunnels. The town's fame was built on its library and the board of scholars that presided over it, dispensing knowledge to those who traveled great distances to find it. Their part in this tale had begun when their master, the owner of the printing shop, had left his business to come to this town in search of a cure for his wife's illness. He'd found it, but when he asked for a copy of the book to take back with him, he was told he would have to pay an exorbitant sum and wait a year for the book to be hand-copied by a scribe. When he took the apparently unknown technology of movable type printing to the board of scholars, they were skeptical that such a thing could truly exist. The print shop owner had written down the information necessary to save his wife, traveled home to do so, and then returned a few months later with a wagon train of equipment from his shop. The first book he copied as a proof of concept to the stodgy old scholars was the Kama Sutra, with full illustrations. Suddenly he had a contract to copy out all the books in the entire library. He'd moved his entire operation into town and spent the last 2.5 years on the job, working through all the books he could get his hands on, and making them all rich as kings. One of the party had the sense to ask why there were only a handful of people left now if this operation had involved nearly 100 people. The answer was that they'd hit the 80% mark in the fall and celebrated with a huge party that had gone on for a full week and consumed more wine than they could imagine. At the end of it, most of the workers had sobered up and shipped home with only a skeleton crew of primarily type makers, the ones who created the lead type pieces, staying behind to print the last 20% of the library. The last 20% would take far longer because it was written in dead languages that few knew how to speak anymore. Oh, and spell books of course. One of them added as an afterthought. The party spent another 3 sessions in this town in the hilltop fortress trying to figure out what the hell was going on as the bizarre events in the border towns began to draw gradually closer and intensify. They eventually figured out that the fortress made of huge obsidian blocks the size used by the Egyptian to build the pyramids had been built by some ancient fire-worshipping order, what with the cold lava tunnels, the old craters around the outside of the walls that were now overgrown, and the odd amphitheater where the stage was made of what looked like long frozen magma. The scholar board were as stuck up and infuriating to deal with as I could make them, so the main interactions the group had with the actual librarians were shouting matches, like when they tried to bring lit torches inside to explore the tunnels. The librarian that found them nearly had an aneurysm. The fact that the library rules forbade fire in anything but their own extremely safe lanterns was delivered in the most demeaning way possible. "What are you doing, you barbarian?" It was the arsehole player who had lit a torch. "Do you have any idea how many libraries are lost to fire? Outside fire is strictly forbidden here." The party eventually rented some of the library approved lanterns, but arsehole was forced to stay behind for the day to serve his time for the terrible risk he'd put the library in. He ended up having to sit and copy out a page from the dictionary by hand, right next to a horny young couple who had also been caught with outside fire while trying to get it on in the underground tunnels. The librarians didn't give a damn about illicit sex. These two were stuck copying out a dictionary because the guy had brought his own light. And yes, the arsehole player really did have to hand copy an entire page from Webster's before being allowed to rejoin the group. Below the surface they found tantalizing clues to the fire worshippers that built the place, but even here things were far from okay. On their first exploration of the tunnels, an enormous flaming hell monster appeared before them and charged, but when they dodged it ignored them and kept running. They followed the noise and found the creature far down the tunnel, brutally attacking the stone wall of the tunnel for no reason, which ended up being a good thing because there was no way they could have taken it down at their level. They chased these clues and hints in a dozen different directions before one of them finally had the patience to sit still and hear the story of the immortal librarian. It turned out that this fire culture's library was a big deal, and that as the founding librarian got old he began to search for a way to cheat death. And he found it. He coded himself into a series of books. The books were called the Librarian Codex, and when arranged in the intended order, spells that ran his consciousness referenced lines and executable spells on books 3 back or 36 forward, all the code running in self-referential like modern computer code. The old wise ass lived happily in paper format for another 200 years before a great cataclysmic earthquake demolished a large section of the library and scattered his books through the rubble. When the survivors picked up the pieces and got to work again, they didn't know what order the books went in or even which ones were part of the codex, so the legend of the immortal librarian gradually faded. The group eventually checked some dates and figured out that the trouble had all begun right after the huge party and the beginnings of the efforts to print the spell books. Normally writing out a spell by hand can have fractional similarities to casting it, but it just gets chalked up to the usual spookiness of a magic library. These guys weren't just handwriting the spells though, they were mass producing them. And to make it even worse, some of the books contained self-referential spells from the codex that said in effect go 4 books and 238 pages left, then execute spell using location specified in book 1 up, 964 pages right. They had executed enough of the codex's spells by accident that it was attempting to bootstrap itself back into working consciousness, but it couldn't because all the books that made it up were still scrambled about the library. The result was random half-executed spells firing off all around with no obvious cause or guidance. The players eventually put the pieces together and reassembled the codex, which, being rather happy to be alive again and possessing various ancient knowledge, rewarded the group handsomely for their efforts. Before I go, I thought this was a great story, well worth a video on its own. Please, if you haven't already, hit the like and subscribe button for me. Also, I agree with Justin, this video needed more waffles.